Well, look, the election ended up not being a referendum on an unpopular president where most voters think the country is headed in the wrong direction, but it ended up being a choice. And I think the Republican governor of New Hampshire summed it up best. And he said the voters said, look, we can fix policy later, but we need to fix crazy now.
Right.
And so what happened? All of the crazies that got nominated by the Republicans lost. And it's because Donald Trump was so far out there. Chris Christie
was it all of them? Not all of them.
All the crazies.
All the
crazies lost. And what Chris Christie, the governor of the former Republican governor of New Jersey, said, he said, look, Trump lost in 2018. Trump lost in 2020. Trump lost in 2021. Trump lost in 2022. We shouldn't be surprised. We need to go in a different direction. Now, that's the big question is, will the Republicans go in a different direction after a midterm that they should have easily taken control of the House? And that's still even a little bit up for grabs and should have gotten the Senate back, and they won't.
Wow. Okay, that's an opener.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Angela, what is your take on it, Angela? We've still got, just talking about the Senate for a second, we've still got 3 states to go. The runoff could last as early as December. How has this election played out for you?
Yeah, I think so. Taking a step back, I think regardless of who actually wins in individual races, to me and actually to our clients, which have been coming to controllers asking, even in the week ahead of the election, I had conversations with people where our house view was we're not going to expect to see a lot of political violence on the day, because even though there's a lot of guns, there's a lot of far right extremists, but there's no call to action by a leader, most likely on the day. And I had clients say to me, that's wrong. It's going to burn down. Wow. Really expecting a high amount of political violence, a high amount of voter intimidation, and a high amount of claims of foul. Yeah. And even in close races, what we saw was clients conceded. Dr. Oz conceded. And so I think, kind of building on Steve's point, the takeaway here is toxic politics isn't working in the states. Candidates want to win. If the playbook of calling foul, throwing all the toys out and whatever isn't winning, again, we may stay as the U.S. very divided, very, entrenched in the kind of cultural issues, guns, God, gender, the rest. But the playbook of we're going to call foul, the legitimacy of the process that everyone was so worried about, I think it's a bit of a referendum on that. Well, and that's great.
Many people thought Joe Biden wasn't taking the right step by talking about democracy being at risk and all of that. And there were other things he should have discussed. But Angela, I just want to stay with you just for a moment on the gender issues, abortion and rights and things like that. That people were not quite sure, from the Democrat side, people thought those would be issues, but they weren't sure if the Republican voters or the independent voters would grab onto those. What's your take on how important those issues were at the end of the day?
I think they were important. I think they were, and Steve would have more of the actual data on it, but I think they were a rallying cry. They did get out the vote. What matters, as we know in midterms, is actually voter turnout. So I think they do matter. But I think, what's interesting again here is to Steve's point, like the crazies didn't win. We saw a situation where what ended up winning was the rule of law in politics and, some kind of legitimacy. So the concerns are, again, the clients have and business has around, is the U.S. a political risk? We never thought we'd say that a couple of years ago, right? But that's receded a bit.
When democracy was on the ballot, democracy won. So, for example, in New Hampshire, you have a mainstream Republican governor wins easily. You have a crazy get nominated for the Senate who's a Republican. He loses badly. So that when democracy was on the ballot, democracy wins. When abortion was on the ballot, abortion won. And you can look at Pennsylvania, New York as an example. Pennsylvania, you could have had a Republican governor, a Republican legislature that could have taken away abortion rights in Pennsylvania. They all lost. New York, where no one was concerned about abortion rights because you have a Democratic supermajority in the legislature. So abortion wasn't on the ballot in New York. Republicans did very well in New York because they knew abortion wasn't at stake there. So in those races where abortion mattered, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, then it helped the Democrats greatly. And so that was what really the takeaway was. Yeah. It was very idiosyncratic, and it helped the Democrats. It probably kept the Democrats. The Democrats will hold the Senate, and the Democrats did way better in the House than they should have. And part of it was democracy, and part of it was abortion, and part of it was Trump, which kind of over encapsulates both of those.
Interesting.
Yeah. Steve, Angela talks about political risk and the potential possibility of political violence. I saw some guys being interviewed on BBC, and they would come through your word, the crazy element, and they said, if the result doesn't go our way, it's clearly fixed, and we want a civil war. Now, they are the crazy element. The point I'm making is there any risk of that? Will they accept the result this time around? Has the crazy element been neutralized?
There is less risk for sure coming out of 2022. And part of it is with Donald Trump is sui generis. You had all these candidates try to follow Trump's lead. They can't. Donald Trump, and he may not be able to do it anymore, but Donald Trump could talk about the big lie, and he could get people out to vote, and he could get all these lawsuits, and he could get insurrectionists to come to the Capitol. But all these other people can't. They're not Donald Trump. And so that risk is way down. You didn't see any violence. However, there are still probably about 150 House Republicans who denied Joe Biden's certification last time around and said they would do it again. So we are not out of risk when it comes to the presidential election. Most of the election deniers who ran for Secretary of State in the individual states who run elections, most of those election deniers lost. You saw them lose in states like, I think in Arizona and Michigan and Pennsylvania, but you may not see them lose in Nevada. So we're not out of the woods yet, but we took a big sigh of relief as a country. And this is the D's won, whether you're a big D Democrat or a small D democracy, both of those won in 2020.
Yeah, Angela, let's move this forward now to business, and we assume that there's going to be roughly a split Congress.
Yeah.
We might get one or two either way, or a few either way, but generally it's going to be a split Congress from what we know today, which means in the past gridlock at the probably mostly gridlock, not getting things done and everybody playing nice and trying to compromise. What do you see the signs of possible headwinds for business in Asia based on what may happen in the U.S. Congress for the next 2 years?
Yeah, well, definitely we're going to have gridlock. I think everyone expected that coming in, and I think the Biden administration's been planning for that. And as we know, whenever we have a divided Congress and in a second, after the midterms, the president tends to turn much more to foreign policy. And we're going to see that. In fact, we're going to see that. I know we're going to speak about it in a few minutes with the G20 kicking off in the next few days. But as it relates to business, a couple things. Again, the overlay I'd say here is the reduction in political risk in the U.S. and the reduction of uncertainty and the reduction of potential erratic policy getting. So the fact that candidates are not, we hope, going to continue to follow the playbook of let's win elections on really,
let's blow everything up.
Let's blow everything up.
Yeah,
the fact that's not what's happening now in the States is very, very good for business here. Again, you can have a conversation around policy and export controls and what we need to do to control inflation. But, underpinning all of it is if we're kind of back to some sense of normalcy in politics in the U.S., if we are, that's really, really good for business, right? So now we have to see what the U.S. is going to do, with a divided Congress. I think a couple things to think about, as I mentioned earlier before we came on the show, I was on a call a few days ago with Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, and it was an on-the-record call. People can look it up on the Council on Foreign Relations website. But it was fascinating because he said he's the first national security advisor, probably in history, to think about supply chains every single day. Critical minerals, semiconductors, electric vehicle batteries, and things like that, right? So that's the one area. So if we think about policy related to supply chain, that hits square in the mark, the intersection for the U.S. of national security and economic policy, industrial policy. And I think that's we're going to see, continued press on that.
One big exception.
Yep.
One big exception. Agree with that, but one big exception, and that's the debt limit.
Yeah.
Right. There's a rule of law in the United States that the U.S. can only go into so much debt, and then Congress has to raise the debt ceiling. And always that debt ceiling gets raised, except one time it looked like it wasn't, and the U.S. got downgraded, and it sent the global economy into tremors. And now, with the Republicans controlling the House, if they do, and it looks like they will, if the Republicans control the House, they say, we will only raise the debt ceiling if you, Joe Biden, cut entitlement spending, cut Social Security, cut Medicaid. Not going to happen. And so the Republicans are going to hold the global economy hostage for non-related policy goals that they have. And if that happens, and if the United States looks like it could default on its debts, that will have massive consequences. So that's the number one thing that I'm going to be watching in what we call the lame duck session of Congress. So between now and when the new Congress comes in and the Democrats control both the House and the Senate, will the Democrats get a debt extension through to stave off the Republicans? And even most thinking Republicans say, let's get this done in the lame duck because we can't afford to have the country default. Donald Trump, when he was president, the debt ceiling was raised all the time. This is not and shouldn't be a partisan issue, but could have huge implications for everybody in the world if we, the United States, default. And that, unfortunately, is a thinkable possibility right
We'll just play that out for the benefit of our listeners. What are the repercussions if that happens in layman's terms for Singapore and Asia?
now. Anybody who's holding U.S. debt doesn't get paid. And most governments hold
U.S. treasuries.
U.S. treasuries.
Yeah.
So if the government can't pay its obligations to those countries and borrowers, it has huge implications because governments rely on that. The dollar is the standard. And if that goes away, what happens to the global economy? Everybody trusts the United States to pay its debts. And now we're not going to do our full, we're not going to have the full faith and obligation of credit from the United States. Unthinkable, except now it's not. So a huge issue, especially if you get a Republican majority with just 4 or 5 seats to lose. And there's enough MAGA Republicans who say, we don't care if we shut down the global economy. We need to think about what's happening here in the United States when it comes to entitlement reform.
The only thing I'd add, though, there is the political side of that as well, which is we are now more or less maybe China aside, although China's easing post-COVID. So the number one issue that voters are caring about, besides, along with democracy, is inflation in the economy. The number one issue that the G20 is going to focus on aside from climate change is the inflation in the economy. So I just wonder if the MAGA Republicans saw that the playbook of really toxic politics, blow it all up, isn't working, how can they press for something that would blow? I mean, Steve's exactly right. It's a huge risk, but the likelihood, I would argue, would be smaller because I think the Republicans now are seeing they have to deliver something for the voters besides just blow it all up.
And the economy was one of the key issues, right?
And I bet that, again, if the seats they hold, the majority they hold is lower, there's perhaps more chance for some kind of negotiation on that.
What would be the priority of Republicans in the next Congress? Doing something for the voters that they campaigned on, or making the Biden administration look bad so that they got a better chance of the White House in 2024?
There is no Republican Party. That's that you got to get out of that mindset, right? So if the Republicans end up holding 215, 220 seats, right? Actually more like 220, they can only afford to lose 5 votes. And so you can forget the Republican Party. If you have 5 people, and there are more than 5 who don't care about the global economy in the Republican Party, Marjorie Taylor Greene would be, a point person number 1. They can hold the entire Republican Party hostage. So you can't be thinking, oh, well, the Republicans think this. There is no Republicans. It's 5 people, 8 people, 10 people who can control it. What do they think? That is why I don't think the United States is going to default, because I think there's enough Republicans who say, let's get this fixed before we take over, because after we take over, we know we can't control our caucus.
Yeah. But to Angela's point, does that have to change? I see post-election a real existential crisis here, not just for US politics, but for the world. They cannot keep getting caught up in what would be seen to be petty domestic issues. Semiconductors, supply chains, the rise of AI, climate change. These have to be front and center now, beyond the petty internal squabblings of the Republican Party, because otherwise the planet is going to suffer, the global economy is going to suffer. Are we going to have to see a shift away from that with the Republican Party?
That's the question. What is Donald Trump going to announce next week? And what's the politics of the Republican Party going to be? And then if he announces for his presidency next week, we don't know. He said he's got a major announcement coming. We don't think it's going to be that there's going to be a new Trump hand sanitizer brand coming out. Right? So he's going to announce for president. And if he does, then what does that shake up? And then you've seen for the past, since he became president, the Republicans in the Congress are afraid to take him on, with very few exceptions. And those who do get kicked out of the Republican Party, like Liz Cheney. So are they all going to go along with the same type of America first, make America great again, we don't care about the world, we only care about what happens within our borders, then we're in trouble.